Okay, I apologize for the delay here. It looks like we gave you a chance to get caught up with your classmates on stuff. My computer doesn't crash often, but when it does, it kind of takes a while for it to load everything back up. There's like several programs running in order for this to all happen. Okay, so we left off looking at the different parts of the tree structure, the basic sort of tree structure, and the claim of this theory is that there's a general skeleton for phrase structure that is going to be the same everywhere. It's going to have the same, for the most part, it's going to have the same components. And we left off, we talked about complements and adjuncts, and we're focusing now on the concept of specifier position. Originally, it's kind of interesting, this position got to be there kind of by accident. It was known that there had to be several layers, and there had to be a top layer, and no one quite knew what to put in that layer right underneath the DP, where where the mother is the phrase level thing, and the sister is an X bar thing. And then it turns out to have an interesting enough answer, and the basic idea is that that's the place where the subjects of things go. And then it turns out that you have subjects in various different places, and there are reasons for saying that there are multiple subject slots in a clause that can be filled. So really sort of going back to very early days, going back to 1970 or so, the idea that at least noun phrases might have subjects was already there in some fashion. Originally, the idea was that an NP could have a subject slot, and that you get that when you nominalize verbs. So if you take a verb, take the army destroyed the city, you can turn that into a noun phrase by taking destroy and taking the verb destroy, turning it into the noun destruction by adding the morphology and so forth. And then you could have the army's destruction of the city. So it would have a kind of parallel structure to the clause. And that idea is what we're going to be capitalizing on here. So the neighbor's mean barking dog, the neighbor's mother, someone's head, all of those kinds of things. In some cases, we just have a plain old N, head or mother. In other cases, we have a more elaborate thing. But there's kind of the same relationship across all of those different things. Now, the actual relationship, if I say the neighbor's mean barking dog, then the relationship between mean barking dog and the neighbor is what? We're talking about the dog. There's a mean barking dog, and we're identifying a particular one. And we're giving more information about it such that we can identify it. What we're giving is a relationship about who the dog belongs to, right? So there's a relationship of belonging. If you take that guy over there's head, it's not exactly, you wouldn't really call it a relationship of belonging, because you wouldn't say, oh, that head belongs to that guy, right? Because belonging is a concept that, it's, in a sense, that's right. But belonging is a concept that has something to do with ownership at some level, right? Not necessarily, right? But still, it would be, if we said that head belongs to that guy over there, we would picture that. It's an okay sentence, but we picture it that the head was not on the guy anymore, right? And that would be weird. But in any case, there's some kind of belonging relationship, or in this case, the head is a part of that guy, right? So there can be a part-whole relationship. The head is one that we recognize in terms of the guy of whom it is a part, right? That's the basic nature of the construction. Okay, so we've got this z thing, and we're going to say that has a meaning, It has everything. It has a phonological structure. It is of category D. We're putting it there because, not because it's, you know, or you say, well, it's like the, oh, you know, who knows? Who cares, right? At some level. We know that what the claim we want to make is that it occupies the D slot, and that accounts for the presence of the neighbor or someone or whatever it is, the presence of a DP in the specifier slot. So it accounts for, at some level, the fact that the DP has something that we could consider to be its subject. And it does that in part by by it having, the claim will be by it having a meaning. And the meaning could be expressed as simply have. Because you could say a guy has a head, right? The head is a part of the guy. You can use the verb have, right? If the dog belongs to the guy, you can say that guy has a dog, right? So have is a fairly, a notion that covers a really sort of large set of tightly unified meanings, right? Very similar sorts of meanings. And so let's say that the meaning of the z thing there is have. And then we say, well, it's part of its phonology would be that it's a clitic left. It's a clitic that adjoins to the left. And then that we account for the fact that it is phonologically attached to the DP that precedes it. And it's attached always on the right end of that DP. And that's the only possibility that we have. So it's actually, in some sense, the presence of the DP subject is guaranteed by the necessity of this thing cliticizing on something at some level as well, but mostly in terms of the meaning. So then we're going to take we're going to be doing something here that we're employing a strategy here that will be employed a lot from here on out. And it is the strategy of allowing for transformations of structures. And it will allow for parts of structures to be empty all over the place by virtue of what we can conceive of as transformations. So there can be nodes in the tree structure that have themselves contain no phonological stuff. Here, you could say just by virtue of the z having to criticize on the phrase that is before it. And so it's sort of a really trivial transformation that is occurring here. But we can also just do this and say that the meaning that that thing has is in that slot. And then we don't really even have to have a transformational rule that moves it there. We can say that the meaning have is what's in that slot all along, and in structures such as this, you automatically insert a z. That's sort of the same story, right? It doesn't really matter how you fashion that story exactly. But so what I'm going to do here is to put those kinds of virtual elements into the tree because we can do it. We have the technology here to have them be in the background, shaded out, right? If you look in the literature, because that's not always a possibility, everyone can't do that, you often see those things when they appear in trees as capitalized elements, so semantic elements that don't have maybe don't have a phonological thing associated with them. In this case, you could say the z is, right? But still, we're going to say that you can have those kinds of things in trees. Does that make sense? So what we're going to be able to capture by doing this is an intuition that we got to very early in this course, that when you have things like ellipsis, you can do that by virtue of the fact that you can recover the meaning and that the meaning is there in your mind. That's whatever the tree structure is. And then we also have a way of accounting for why things mean what they do and why those meanings are associated with certain structures. Because we're able to recover the meanings from the structures themselves, the combination of the structures themselves, the meanings of the overt words, and our knowledge about what the covert stuff is that's there from either being able to be recovered from the discourse context, or by our knowledge of very, very sort of abstract stuff like that. There's a meaning have somehow or other associated with Z. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So we can say then that the meaning of the whole DP is the mean barking dog that is in an identifying have relationship, where have is an abstract concept covering belonging and being a part of and owning and all kinds of things, right? And that relationship can be understood in terms of the subject of these things being a reference point for identifying. One way of thinking about it. So it's a reference point. I'm taking this idea from a paper by Ronald Laniker, actually a professor of mine when I was a PhD student, who was also in the 1970s was busy at work with Chomsky and company. He wasn't a student of Chomsky's, but he was busy making some of understanding some of the really basic transformations that were to become a part of transformational grammar. But he then went on to develop a theory of meaning in which this stuff would all make sense but he doesn't have the trees anymore. In any case, so this is we're specifying, so specifier makes some sense, right? We're specifying which mean barking dog we have in the discourse by virtue of using as the reference point of that thing something that is in a having relationship with it, is what's going on semantically. Okay, so then we can say that this is the syntactic subject of the DP. This NP here, so it's different than other constructions that we'll see where there is a subject. So we have a subject and a clause. It will be the case that the subject of the clause is also something that for which in the case of a clause, the verb phrase we can say that it is predicated of the subject. In this case, you don't want to say that because, so if I said the neighbor kicked the mean barking dog, kicked the mean barking dog is being predicated of the neighbor. And that's in part because kicked has the semantic argument, agent, has two semantic arguments, the agent and the patient. And in the neighbor kicked the mean barking dog, the neighbor would be an argument of kick, right? In this case, we're saying, no, that neighbor here is an argument of have, the virtual have that has as its instantiation the z on the end of the neighbor. But mean barking dog is not a predicating thing. That's a noun phrase. And noun phrases don't typically predicate stuff, typically. And so this is a little bit different than some kinds of, that's how we explain the sense in which this is a possessor. We talk about it as being a possessor phrase, maybe, and not as and not being in some ways like the prototypical subject. The prototypical subject of a clause, for example, would be in an argument relation with the verb, the head verb of the whole thing. In this case, we don't have that situation. But we can have that situation if we make the noun phrase be one that is, I mean, this is interesting, right? Because it's sort of the same thing. We get the same structure, but we can change this around to where we get it to be the case that the DP in the subject, in the specifier slot of the DP, is an argument of the noun. So if we say something like the dog's incessant barking, because barking is a verb that has been turned into a noun, it has two arguments. Well, no, actually, in this case, it has an argument. The argument is the dog, right? Barking is something that dogs do, right? And the barking that we're talking about here is barking by the dog, right? So the dog's incessant barking can be paraphrased as the incessant barking from the dog or by the dog or whatever, because there's a relationship now, in this case, between, there's an argument relation, a semantic argument relation between barking and dog, right? And that would be the case whenever we have or usually when we have a noun that is derived from a verb. Nouns derived from verbs have the same basic meaning as the verb. And so instantiations of the semantic arguments of the verb within the DP will be arguments. But nothing really changes otherwise, in a sense, right? We still have phonologically, we have the clitic, z, but we just see that this is sort of more like a prototypical subject relation. It's the subject of the whole thing. It is in the possessive phrase form, but semantically, the incessant barking here, the NP, is predicated of the subject of the whole thing. So the sense in which we say this is a subject is really, in some sense, an extension here of subject of clause, subject of other things. And then it's not very much farther to go to get to the other case that we looked at earlier, where there's just a concrete noun that's in a having relationship with the possessor. And so notice this isn't even possession. The dog's incessant barking, it doesn't even make sense to say it belongs to the dog, right? Except for very abstractly, right? And you wouldn't even say that the dog has incessant barking, right? But still, it's sort of the same thing. We can then have things like the neighbors constant complaining about me, the neighbors letting my dog bark, and things like that, right? So we can get almost give me any verb phrase, and that would have a subject, right? Give me anything like that, and I can rephrase it like this. I can give me a clause as input. I can turn it into a noun phrase. This actually was the observation, this parallel behavior of possessors of noun phrases and subjects of clauses is what led originally to the hypothesis that there is something like X-bar theory. It was in a paper by Noam Chomsky himself in 1970. I can't remember. Do you remember the name of it? I don't remember. It was a famous paper in 1970 where he let go of a lot of the power of transformations that had been operating at that time, but explained a lot of things by using X-bar theory. Okay, so then if we look at verb phrases, let's take this one, letting my dog bark constantly. Here we would have a verb phrase, right? Like I was letting my dog bark constantly because I just wanted to annoy the neighbors, right? Perfectly good sentence, right? In that case, we've got a verb phrase structure of some kind, right? And it's going to have the parallel structure. Same kind of thing you get inside the noun phrase. But you're just, all we've done here really is substitute, in some sense, substitute V's for N's. But the structure is exactly the same as we want to have for the noun phrase. And so then we can say that, I mean, here, it's actually a little bit controversial what the structure of sentences like this is, verb phrases like this, where I've been letting my dog bark constantly. You've got two verbs, right? And you've got the verb letting, and what does it have as its complement? Well, it doesn't look to be anything. The structure that it has there, my dog bark constantly, is simply DP, verb, adverb, right? So one possibility is that you have something like this. Now, the other possibility that I think is actually wrong is to have this be a clause with lots of empty structure. So the original analysis would have been let my dog barks constantly, or something like that, right? A full clause with all of the structure of a clause, and then you delete all of the stuff that would make it be like a clause. For example, there is no, the verb here has to be in the infinitive form. It cannot be in this structure, it cannot be in an inflected form. And the prototypical clause has tense in it, has a manifestation of past or present tense. This one can also not, doesn't have auxiliaries. Letting my dog may bark constantly, or anything like that, right? So it doesn't have the full clause structure. So if you go that way, you have to have a different story. And, you know, it might be that that's ultimately right, but you don't go there unless you have good reason to. On the surface, this is all we have. So let's say that we can have subjects then. What that gives us is that you can have subjects of VPs, right? The syntactic subject of this VP is my dog, right? And it's a semantic argument of the head V, bark. And then when we turn it into a noun phrase, we just take the same structure over. All I've done here is to change the V's with N's, right? Nothing else. But then, because we do that, we have to make certain adjustments. And NP will have to, an NP will ordinarily be embedded in a DP. That's the nature of the ball game. So we put it inside of a DP. And the prototypical DP for this sort of thing would be the DP subject, z, have. Have as the meaning element there. And then we have to make some other adjustments. The adjustments we have to make, one adjustment is, well, wait a minute, you can't have constantly there. Because why? Because that's the adverb form of the adjunct modifier constant, right? So we have to change it into the adjective form. And the rules of English are that adjective modifiers of N bars go pre-verb, pre-nominal. They go in the pre-head slot. They're adjunct modifiers to the left. So we just make that change. And we've got, I'm not saying that there's a transformation that has occurred here. Actually, that's what Chomsky originally argued against in the 1970 paper, because he didn't like that the movement was going into a direction where there were hella transformations over these huge structures in order to get simple sentences. And so he said one of the transformations was nominalization. And I said, give me a clause, and I'll turn it into a noun phrase. And as I turn it into a noun phrase, I change things and move them around. And he said, no, with X-bar theory, we can capture everything about the sameness of these kinds of things by just having the skeletal structure be the same. And we can have the noun barking be something that is a transform in the lexicon, or it's related in the lexicon to the verb barking. There's a verb barking, that would be part, you know it has certain stuff. You know that there's also a rule that says when you have a verb barking, you can turn it into a noun as a general rule. And when you turn it into a noun, then you better stick it into a structure that's appropriate for a noun phrase. And when you do that, if you want to modify it, then you automatically have to put in adjective phrase rather than adverb phrase and so forth. Okay, so that's the basic idea here. We would have my dog would be something that, so we can imagine, so here's where we get to the transformational part. The transformation part that survives, the transformation idea that survives is that there's a kind of underlying structure that has the meaning spilled out over it. And there are grammatical things that have to happen in order to get the right overall structure at the end of the day. And so one of the principles is, if you are, I didn't really say this earlier, but one of the principles will be, if you are an argument of a head, then you are in the phrase that head projects. This N, barking, projects an NP, doesn't project the DP. There's something about the grammar that necessitates the DP, but the noun itself projects only an NP, a noun phrase, right? Because that's part of X-bar theory and so forth, right? So another principle, and this seems to work mostly, is that if you are a semantic argument of it, and then you are instantiated at some level, underlyingly or whatever, at least, as a constituent of the phrase that head projects. That's a very sort of general principle. Could be wrong, but it is an assumption that has some merit and that is able to work out. But in order for it to work out, one of the things that you have to have is certain kinds of transformation. And in this case, the transformation that has to occur is what? My dog, which is the subject of the NP, needs to be copied. Here's one way of thinking about it. Copy that and put it in the subject of DP slot as well. You actually don't even have to think of this as being a transformation. That's the way it's typically thought of. But you could also just say, in this sort of situation, my dog is both the syntactic subject of the whole thing and the syntactic semantic subject of the NP. So you could just say, it occupies both places, right? You could think of it, there are different ways of thinking of this. The standard way is to say, you started out in the NP, and then you make a copy and move that copy, put that copy up at the top, and then when you do that, you delete the lower version of it. So you're not going to repeat it, right? We know, it's sort of silly to say, well, my dog, constant barking, is just stupid, right? But so the copy is suppressed in phonetic form. Phonologically, it's not there, but it leaves a trace of itself in some sense. So basically the claim is that our knowledge of these things is that we know that my dog is up there at the top, in the topmost part, and it has to be there for grammatical reasons. But we still know that the DP, my dog, is an argument of barking and is the subject of barking at some level. So we can say that so the meaning of the whole DP is the same as we get in other possessive phrases in some sense, right? The constant barking that is what we're talking about is the constant barking that is in an identifying have relationship with my dog, right? I have in an abstract sense. It abstractly is something that is identified with the dog. It's the barking that, and so forth. So this is a blend of the verb meaning is still there at some level, but this is also a noun phrase type meaning. and has the same meaning as possessor phrases at some level. And then the way that this is typically represented is that because you don't, okay, here's why, right? Because of the, I guess, the lack of this fading in and out of font brightness is not something that you could do on typewriters. And people were making this stuff up when they were still using typewriters. And so that you had to make everything be represented in some way like that. And so the mechanism that was used, and continues to be used, usually is like this. We say that DP, my dog, that's part of my dogs, has been moved from its underlying subject of NP position. And when that happens, it leaves a trace of itself. And we annotate that trace in the structure with T for trace. And then we put these subscript I's on there, right? So typically you wouldn't have to identify more than a few things in a sentence. So you would use I, J, K. If you had to go to L, you might, right? You could go as far as you want. But you start in the alphabet with I, you make them subscript on the trace, and then the idea of that is that we know that my dog is essentially occupying both of those slots. In a way, that means it's both an argument of constant barking, and it's the subject of the whole thing and of the have clause or have structure there. And then this all happens because of the structure of X-bar theory. Our need in English to have NPs in general be embedded within DPs, and the need for semantic arguments to be expressed in legitimate positions. And that's sort of what a large part of the game of syntactic theory is, right? Is to figure out what are the structures that you need in order to allow us to interpret things in the appropriate way, as well as account for the order in which the words appear and everything else. And so there's a constraint to the effect that you interpret things based on the positions in trees that they're in. And if you're a semantic argument of something, and you're the agent argument of something like barking, then you're going to be in that position as that would be a legitimate position. And it also is partly a consequence of having this particular D in the structure. Its meaning, because of its meaning, because of its general requirements, you're going to have the DP in that position on the surface. Okay, so we get the right interpretation by virtue of, here's the claim, and this is just critical to understanding syntax, our knowledge of the routine structures and our ability to apply the routine structures over anything that you give us as input, and from those routine structures to be able to compute the meanings. Because that's what the whole game is, right? Getting meanings out of sequences of phonological forms. I think I'm just repeating the same thing here. Sorry. Same slide over, just ignore this. Okay. So then we want to, so the next step is, okay, what do we do with clauses? So I'm sort of repeating the same kind of move that I made earlier. We start out understanding one part of the system, and then once we have a pretty good understanding of that, then we take it to the more complex parts. So the complexity of a clause is going to be greater than the complexity of a noun phrase. But you still can find parallel structures across both. That's the basic idea of X-bar theory. So we know already that we have to have some kind of phrase structure like this that shouldn't is outside of something that can be that can undergo verb-phrase ellipsis. And we're assuming that the only thing that we can work with at any point is X-bar theory, as we see there. The same skeletal structures. Things are either identified as specifiers or complements if they're arguments, right? So the same structure across everywhere we look. If you're an argument of a head, then you are a complement or a specifier. If you are anything else, you're an adjunct. And the adjuncts go in different slots. Again, they can go on either side depending on what kind of adjunct you're talking about and what kind of head you're talking about. So we've got that sort of thing. We know that the B, so we've got shouldn't be dropping the baskets right next to the table. She could be dropping the baskets. She should be dropping the baskets right next to the table, but he should. I'm just making up, arbitrary random sentences, right? But with enough structure so that we can see what the game is. But he shouldn't, and if we're right about the general claim that you can elide things that are whole constituents, then we know that B dropping the baskets right next to the table must be a phrase of some kind. So let's say it's a VP. B is like a verb-like thing, right? But we also know it's an auxiliary verb, and we know that shouldn't is as well, right? So we have to figure that all out. What are those things? What kind of phrase is the whole thing? We know that shouldn't be dropping the baskets right next to the table is also a phrase, right? And so what kind of a phrase is it? And what's the overall structure? So, each X is the head of one and only one XP, and each phrasal node is a projection of one and only one X, and so forth, right? That's the basic structure. We've got to have that somehow or another. So let's say we've got a should here. We don't know what category it is. We've got we'll take the case here. We've just got should drop the baskets right next to the table. Should is in some kind of superordinate phrase with drop the baskets right next to the table as a verb phrase. Drop the baskets is a smaller unit within that. And we know that because it's the baskets is a complement, an argument, a semantic argument of drop. Direct objects, those DPs that come right after verbs and are semantically closely related to them, are complements. It's in that sort of structure. And then right next to the table is some kind of an adjunct, right? With next to the table, was this part of the homework, right? You might not have gotten this answer and that'd be okay, but does it look right? Did I do something wrong? Oh, the N bar should be an NP, right? No? Yeah. I didn't get it. The baskets thing should be an NP. Did I get something else wrong? There's triangles everywhere right here, right? But that should be, baskets should be an NP, right? Yeah, what were we saying? I got something wrong?
No, I just was commenting.
Oh, it wasn't, but you had something with, didn't you have something right next to something? Right next to the bar, whatever. Same structure, right? The one thing that's hard here is that it's not clear what next to is, right? But I think there's no reason, because there's a right that can go there, then it's got to be a preposition, right? And I don't see any evidence that it's not just a compound preposition like into, next to, right? Is there some reason to believe it's anything else? other than the spelling. Spelling you can't go with, guys. It doesn't work. There's no reason to consider it to be anything else. We have those all over the place. Onto, into, underneath. All of these things, right, are compound prepositions that involve the incorporation of nouns, typically, into prepositions to create a bigger preposition. Okay, so we've got structure like that. How does this all work out? We know we have to have, X bar theory says we've got to have, should has to project a whole phrase, right? And there has to be an X bar place, and we know then that he should be the subject of that whole phrase. Makes sense, right? Would be in the specifier. So we've got specifier, head, complement. Within that, whatever that question phrase is, it's going to have specifier, head, should, and complement. Right? And we want to say it's a complement because should requires that there be a VP after it. Right? Now, you may not want to say that he is in a semantic argument relationship with should. But that's going to be okay. We're going to fix that. There's going to be a reason for that. Because the specifier slot, okay, keep this in mind for everything that we're doing, the specifier slot can be an argument of the head of which it is specified. But it doesn't have to be. Complements, on the other hand, have to be semantic arguments of the thing that they're complements of. So there's a kind of, specifiers are more versatile. They can be semantic arguments of the head, but they don't have to be. Complements have to be. There's no other choice. All right, so we should house as a semantic argument and complement the VP. So we've got a structure like this. I don't know why I did that. Oh, I was giving evidence for the P-like nature of next to. So we've got, let's say we've got this. He should drop the baskets right now. This is sort of the basic story, the most, the tamest version of the story, and a standard one. It's the one that the online textbook that I directed you to is using. And the idea is that modal auxiliaries and do would be things that only can ever occupy this particular slot in the phrase structure. And that particular slot will also be the one that will have verb inflection on it if there is something other than a main verb that is in the clause. It's going to be in that slot. So should is in the past tense form morphologically. Shall is the present tense form. It doesn't mean that should has a past tense meaning, but shall and should are in a relationship of with inflectional properties, just like will and would, can and could, and we know that at some level, even though, as I said, it's not the case that the meaning is past versus present, but still there's a basic requirement on clauses that they have a tense element, an element that is morphologically showing tense, and tense is a kind of inflectional property. So we use I for inflection, inflectional. And so there's an inflectional head of the clause. And the reason for doing this, by the way, is that looking across languages, we find it to be the case that you can say this about most of them. That there is one slot in the clause that is the place where you would put tense in agreement. In some languages, you might have you might be able to have copies of some of those things, usually agreement could be, or you could spread them out. You could have tense in one slot and agreement in another. But a very common thing to do is to have an auxiliary slot, an auxiliary verb slot in the clause. And that's the place that you find the inflectional morphology. That's the place where you find agreement with subject and object if you have object. That's if you have those things. Mm-hmm. Some languages don't have any of these things. But they're still compatible with the story because they're just not incompatible. You could say that there's meaning things like that in all languages, and if the language doesn't happen to overtly use this slot, it's not really a problem. So that's the basic idea. There's some languages that have every clause has to have an auxiliary. And English is kind of on the way to being like one of those languages. It has to have an auxiliary verb no matter what. And that is the place where you have to put the tense and the agreement with the subject and maybe agreement with object as well. So and when you have languages like that, then you have them working like English. The auxiliary slot, if it's a head initial language, the auxiliary slot would be there, right before the verb phrase. So that stuff is all, extremely regular across languages. Not that it's always that way, but it's very, very regular. So we've got a kind of story here that starts out as, well, we've got an inflection phrase. That was originally. The clause with tense in it is an inflection phrase. Then it started being called inful, because inflection is too big to write out right. And so you had inful and inful bar and inful p. And then we said, well, why write out inful? We'll just do I. And so we have IPs. The clauses with tense in them are IPs. Okay, are you with me here? I'm going pretty slowly here. If I'm going too slowly, say, okay, we already know all this. Is this new stuff? Yeah. Well, a clause can not have tense in it. It depends on where you're going to draw the line of clauses, right? But if you say, take something like, I want you to do your homework. You to do your homework doesn't have any past tense or inflection or anything like that, right? Right? That's an infinitival thing, right? Is it an infinitival clause? Well, in this theory, it would be an infinitival clause. But what would be in the I slot? I want you to do, where do is a main verb, right? I want you to do your homework. What's that to thing? It's what? But what does infinitive marker mean? That's kind of just arbitrary grammatical terminology, right? What does it do? What is the to doing? It's demanding that the verb after it be in the infinitive form, right? I want you to be on time, right? Be is that you have to use be to make sure you're getting the infinitive form, right? So it's doing just like what should does, right? Should demands that the thing after it be in the infinitival form. But should, you can say, is a tensed, morphologically tensed element. To is not even, as far as we can tell, a verb, right? Is it? I mean, you wouldn't. Historically, it comes from a preposition, right? But it's sitting in, as far as we can tell, it's sitting in the same slot as should. It doesn't allow a modal auxiliary to come after it, but it allows any other kind of auxiliary, just like should does. Should have been going to the store. I would have liked for you to have been going to the store. If can't do it in every infinitival structure, right? So then in that case, the I node contains a preposition, at least historically, that has the function of saying, I am a clause without tense at all. So it's marking no tense at all. And then you might have other kinds of clauses, as we'll see, that are things that are clause-like and isn't clear. And they clearly do not have tense. And so where you draw the line isn't clear. All right. So that's the basic idea. Tense clauses, in general, will have this structure where there's an IP, not an S, right? And now we have a story for how clauses fit into X-bar theory. This was proposed, this basic story was proposed by Noam Chomsky when he made another revolution in the theory in a book called Barriers, 1986, a little book that is basically impossible to read and doesn't really cohere, but the message from this was taken up, and it was because it was the first proposal about how to get rid of S's that don't have heads. Clauses are phrases, they have heads. Once you recognize that tense, inflectional stuff can count as the head of a clause. Okay, and then what about embedded clauses? So I said, you can take this clause, he should drop the baskets right now. And we could embed that in another clause by using a verb that takes a clausal complement like said, and then we can put in this that thing, right? So this is actually the two things that Chomsky did in that book I was talking about. The proposal to deal with clauses as inflectional phrases, and a proposal to bring this that thing into the theory and have it all fit into X-bar theory in a way that works well and explains certain things. So one of the things about this is that if we put a that there, like that, it has to project a phrase. That's part of X-bar theory, right? And if it does that, and it's clearly just a word, right? You can't put a phrase in place of it. Then we would expect certain things, that would have a complement, and the complement would be the clause. Because the meaning of that is such that it's kind of hard to say exactly that complement is a semantic argument, because you can't tell, right? The meaning is so bleached that it's hard to make that claim and prove it in any sense, right? But you could say that it is like an argument in being obligatory. You can't have a that without the clause being stuck in there, right? So it's like that. It's like a head in that respect. But also, if you look across languages, just like I was saying, that whole story for how auxiliaries it makes sense to have them be in the head of clause slot, at least some kinds of auxiliaries. And part of the reason is that if you're in a language that has verb first, then the auxiliary will come before the verb phrase, following the general structure of the language, heads before complements. This that thing comes before its complement, because English is a head first language. And if we look at these things across languages, what do we find? We find that there's a strong correlation between the placement of those kinds of things, what we call complementizers, by the way. That's not a traditional term from you wouldn't find that in the Oxford English Dictionary, I don't think, but they would usually call it, I don't know, what do they call this in traditional grammar? A subordinating conjunction, whatever that is. And I guess historically, it's got to come from the same thing as that, right? The demonstrative thing, right? It's got to be. But I don't know how this ever happened, but it does make some sense when you start thinking about it like that. Well, historically, it was a D. But now it's in a place where we don't have a noun phrase, we have a clause, right? Or maybe we do have a noun phrase, right? one analysis of these things is that embedded clauses are noun phrases in which you have clauses embedded, right? And so you could even see spinning out that story, right? This is a DP, right? And that is the D, just like in with demonstratives. The meaning is somewhat different because of the structure or whatever, right? And instead of an NP complement for that D, right? Couldn't you do that? You could spin out a story like that, I think. And it would be coherent, and it would make some sense historically. So actually, there's different hypotheses. That's one of them, right? You've got that D that takes a finite IP, right? Because a constraint. So that is putting a constraint on its complement that it be a clause and IP. And that clause be finite, meaning that it have a tensed form, not an infinitive form. There has to be either a verb or an auxiliary that's in an inflected past or present tense form. So that's one way to do it, and then it would be parallel to things like the and z and these, right? But those take NP complements, and this takes an IP. And then you also have some things like this that can have DP complements. So D, if we're going to consider these to be Ds, you can have things like all the boys on the team, all the players on this team, all, and then the players on this team, right? So we've got this, so certain of these quantifier type determiners can have DPs as their complement. So there's a range of things that under this hypothesis, there would be a range of things, making them like verbs. Verbs can have different complements. Verbs can have PP complements. They can have DP complements. They can have IP complements, or whatever. They can have clausal complements, whatever those are. So that's not actually a bad story. It's not one that has been pursued very much, and I'm not sure why, but whatever. Another way to do it. Any other ways? What else? So stopping for a minute, going back. Languages that have complementizers and they are head first will have those complementizers in pre-clausal position. Only languages that are head last would have the complementizers after the clause. Some of those languages would allow you either option, or most of them probably wouldn't even have complementizers because it's not a necessary thing to have. What else could we do? Anybody else? You haven't seen this, right? You never heard the story, right? What, any other ideas that we could have it be the case? So let's have it be the case that it fits in and it doesn't require us to make up any new categories. Well, a D, that works, and it sort of looks right, because historically we know it comes from a D. Would it make any sense to say it's a V, a verb? Well, you could, whatever, you could make up anything, right? But it sort of wouldn't make much sense because it doesn't even have verb-like meaning of any kind, right? And it doesn't have any verb properties. There's no past tense form, and this is the only place it could go, right? So it would be weird, right? What else could we do? Anything else? What's left? Preposition or adverb, right? Or adjective or whatever, right? It wouldn't be an adjective. But a preposition actually that idea has been pursued, and there's some evidence for that. It's not a bad analysis. So it would be a P of the form that. It doesn't have all of the, there's some ways in which it doesn't work, but there are some ways in which it works just fine. So there are prepositions that can have finite DPs and IPs after them, or DPs and finite IPs, right? So before the movie, what is before going to be, right? before the movie, we should do the dishes, right? Or before we watch the movie, where we watch the movie is a finite IP. And you can't say, right? You can't say before that we watch the movie, can you? Before that we watch the movie, no, it doesn't work, right? Why not? Well, here's an explanation. That is just another alternative. And that's the one that you use if you're not using a preposition that has some intrinsic meaning, right? Before and after actually have meanings that you can specify, right? It has to do with time, places in time, right? Spaces in time. And they can sometimes, and you can also have VP-ing structures after these things. So before going to the movies, right? After doing the dishes, we should blah, 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 right? So these are prepositions as far as we can tell. And so it could make some sense to do that. What ended up being done by most people was to say, well, let's just call it something different. And we'll call it a complementizer. Because it makes complement clauses occur. So it complementizes verbs or something or other. I don't know, they just made this crap up, right? It was a new word that the generative grammarians made up. So we could say, yeah, but it's like a P in that it has a head, and the head has to be a finite IP. And there's a fairly small class of complementizers in the language, and other languages maybe don't even have them, and other languages would have different ones. In Spanish, it would be que. Que could also be used for other things, right? And there would be other cases where you would use prepositions before clauses, right? Before infinitival clauses, for example, it's like English. You can put a before some of them, the preposition to, just like English, right? But then there's another one that we have that's for. And you get this when you have for would be able to go with, so notice it's kind of interesting. Here's another reason for saying, oh, they're prepositions, right? For, we know is a preposition, historically, right? But what do you do with it in place, and it can have a DP complement, right? I'm going to do this for my sister. My sister's a DP. For has that as a complement. But it can also have non-finite, a non-finite IP as its complement, right? So I would like for you to do the dishes. I would like for you, what is that? Or for you to do this right now would be stupid. What's for you to do this right now? It's you to do this right now. A clause, infinitival. It's got that to marker in it, right? And then it's got this thing at the front. The hell is that, right? Well, under this story, it's a complementizer. It's the mirror image complementizer for that. Historically from a preposition, that historically from a determiner. But this one takes non-finite form of IP only. And actually, you have to specify, has to be headed by to. And then you also get another kind of complementizer, possibly, is the indirect question complementizer. Or, is that what it is? No, that one is weather. There's a weather one, right? Like, so I wonder whether I should go. That's plausibly another one of those things that would be in an embedded clause that is an indirect question. I wonder, and then there's a question, but I'm not actually asking you a question, right? It's what wonder does. And then you can't put that there. You have to put whether. And then actually, if works that way too, right? If can work in the same context. I wonder if I should go, right? So there's in those kinds of contexts, you get a different complementizer. And how many of those there are? Not very many, right? I sort of just did them all. I think nowadays they say that weather isn't one of those. And weather has a different property. Okay, so then that's the story we're going to go with. Whether the other ones are, however plausible or workable, viable, the other ones might be. This became standard. This is the one that Chomsky proposed. Other people came along later and said, no, it's a P. There wasn't much debate about that. Chomsky always wins, independently of how good the evidence is. So then it has and then we note also that the way that we're going to deal with the fact that you can say, I said he should drop the baskets right now, without the that, is going to be what? It's still a CP, but it's like those DPs that have the missing D, right? It's going to be a CP no matter what. If the that is not there, it's either because it's been deleted or that it's just not there, right? Phonologically. It could be just something as simple as, in the right context, don't bother to say that little word because it's so small and it's unstressed. Which would be something that happens all over the place. Happens routinely. There are some constraints on when you can do this. You can only do it apparently when the CP occurs right after a verb that takes it as its complement. So if you take one of these and put it in the subject position, that I did that, nobody believed, would be okay, right? I did that, nobody believed, is that okay? No, the that has to show up. So under certain conditions, it's always got to be there, but it can be phonologically empty under others. Could be a transformation, deletes it, whatever, who cares? So there will be things like this with virtual, or, do it however you want. We can do, since we have light shading, we could have clauses might always have those in them. And one of the reasons for saying that, so here now we're going to get into some, just briefly, we'll start down this path. Well, maybe we shouldn't. This is going to get complicated, right? We'll do this one next time. I'm going to show you how you do the classic parts of the grammar of English. Questions. Yes, no questions. Should I do that? I should do that, shouldn't I? Tag questions, right? And how you can make sense out of all that largely because of the structures we're saying we